In this section of 3 is Bob Newton on White Arctic, Blue Arctic. Take it away, Bob. Hello. So I wanted just to present some ideas that are in a commentary that's coming out in Earth's Future. It's in the packet of stuff that Teresa has archived for everybody up on the Google Drive. It's an article that this group of us, Stephanie, Peter, Bruno, Maribeth, Rafe, and myself put together. It really was a quasi conference report from the meeting we had in 2013, which in some sense was a precursor to the work that these guys have been doing with regard to the ministerial and to this meeting. We've started, I work with Bruno and Stephanie and I and some of Bruno's graduate students have been doing a lot of work with sea ice from the NSIDC Polar Pathfinder data set lately. And we've started to put our work in the context of the exclusive economic zones instead of simply doing it in terms of the Arctic shelf seas in order to make the kinds of links between science and policy that we're trying to get to today. This is one of the ways I like to see the progression of the loss of sea ice. This is the annual cycle from left to right and years going from the bottom to the top, and you can see the trend. This is the percent of open water at each week in the satellite record, and you can see that the trend is really clear. And in terms of what Craig was talking about, people actually respond to weather, not climate. They respond to what's going on here and now. You can see, that the length of the open water season is already dramatically expanding, and if anything, is accelerating in the more recent years. And there's no reason to believe that that trend is not going to continue going forward. And the points that we made in this, not a scientific paper per se. It's primarily trying to make some points about policy and governance and trying to integrate what this group of people and many of our colleagues are saying and put it in a policy context. And we made two or three key points I just want to, in the couple of minutes I have, hit just to say. So one of the key points of the article is that as we adapt to a new world, as we adapt to a new annual cycle in the Arctic, as we adapt to global warming globally, there's no reason to think that, quote, society is going to have an even and unified response to what is happening. That in fact there is likely to be, there's already visible and likely to accelerate, the same way that the loss of ice is accelerating. There's going to be an increasing divergence in responses to the new world. One of the things, we've been talking in terms of policy about a lack of political will. And to some extent, I completely agree with that, Rafe, that what we're lacking is political will. But to some extent, what we're actually seeing, what that's masking is a divergence of political will. There was a study done a few years ago by Bob Buell at, I think he's at Penn State or UPenn, I'm not quite sure. No, he's at Drexel. Looked at just the publicly available records of funds spent on climate denial. So this is just money that's going through think tanks and nonprofits that have to report their funding. And we are up in the $1 billion a year range. This is not people who are uninformed. These are intellectuals. These are people who understand the issues and have a really different view on this, right? So what we looked at is in terms of Arctic sea ice as well, what services is the Arctic sea ice providing? There's a lot of services it provides within the Arctic, wildlife habitats, subsistence hunting and fishing, coastal infrastructure support, essentially as a protection of the coastal environment and the coastal villages. And it also has traditionally created, people talk about American exceptionalism. People have for the last 30 or 40 years talked about, well, really since the Second World War, the Arctic exceptionalism. By virtue of these by virtue of these Arctic nations being separated by a perennial ice pack, it has been, despite the fact that it is a Mediterranean Sea surrounded by many of the most powerful and most internationally active nations in the world, it has been a very peaceful and collaborative place, right? One of the things that's happening as the Arctic ice thins in the winter and disappears in the summer is that the transit distances between these nations is going dramatically down. You can see it in the ice pack itself. You've seen about an 18 or 19% per decade acceleration in the speed that ice flows at, and an accelerated communication in a natural environment between the nations, but also in the opening up of shipping lanes and tourism and moving towards Arctic shipping, at least in the summertime, as an efficient shipping route. So just to go on with this list, so there are within Arctic sea ice services, but there are also, and this is something that we've talked about a lot here, there are global Arctic sea ice services, and particular planetary albedo, but in addition, ocean circulation and the role of sea ice formation in the North Atlantic overturning circulation. There's carbon storage, there's atmosphere and weather, and the impacts on middle latitude. There's sea level. The northern, having a glacial continent with a northern boundary condition of open water is very different than having a northern boundary condition of intense reflectivity. So those are the services it provides. But we've also talked a lot about, as it opens up, it's going to make available a whole new set of development opportunities. And there's no real reason to believe that everybody's going to have a unified reaction to that. At a local level, within communities, there are some people who really view the loss of sea ice as a loss of a way of life. There are other people who view the opening up of ports and tourism and shipping and an increase in extractive industry activity as a way, as a development opportunity, as new jobs and better jobs, and an increasing link to the more cosmopolitan communities in their nations at a lower latitude. So we think these are really, in dealing with these issues, in dealing with policy, we think we will do better if we are aware and cognizant and knowledgeable about the fact that not all of this is, we aren't dealing with a monolithic society that has a unified response to this, that there are real divergences, and in dealing with people, we have to be honest and straightforward and take those on, head on. Another thing we talk about is, I'm running out of time, right? I'll get this done. I think one of the unique things that we haven't talked about a lot, not only is this an enormous challenge of unprecedented scale and complexity, although the more I listen to this, the more I'm in this, the less I'm worried about the complexity. I mean, actually, I feel like it's getting clearer and clearer. But the scale of infrastructure shift and policy shift required to deal with these issues is truly enormous. But I also think it's the first time that I can think of, or I think that, when we have had this capacity to predict into the future. I mean, we can't predict the weather 4 decades out, but we have a pretty good handle on what direction the climate is going in. And I think that's a real paradigm shift for policy and especially for for governance in general. I mean, governance is very accustomed to reacting to disaster, reacting to crisis, but to react to a statement by a community such as ours that there's an impending crisis that we are confident we can predict 2, 3, 4, 5 decades into the future, I think is truly novel in human history. So one of the things we did at the last meeting that was in the report is we started to think about, well, what is going to happen? And I think there's a kind of we think of there is, I know very few people who I work with on the policy side, in science, in social science, who really believe we're going to get the carbon out of the air in a time scale fast enough to prevent the loss of summer sea ice in the Arctic. On the other hand, I know very few people who don't believe that as sea level comes up in Florida, as we start to lose the river deltas in sub-Saharan Africa, I know very few people who don't believe we will at some point take action and bring the CO2 out of the atmosphere and start to stabilize climate and bring the climate back towards the 20th century. Well, you know, we need to think about what does that mean, right? And if you think about it in terms of the sea ice, the most likely, there's very little hysteresis. The models indicate there's very little hysteresis. The most likely thing is that we will actually bring the sea ice back. And you have to think about, well, what are generations if you have 2, 3 generations of people who grew up in an ice-free environment in the summer, what is their opinion about bringing that sea ice back? All right, my time is up. I want to stop, but just to, you know, just to raise some issues about governance that maybe have not been central to the conversation to date. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bob. That was a good complement to the other 2 presentations. So I think we have a really good body of information and opinion and thought here to provoke a discussion. So I'm going to open it up. Brendan.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciated both panels. But I really feel a tension here between these 2 panels that I think it would be really good for us to take on and consider. And I would say that, you know, listening to Vera talk about the potential threat to their home was pretty powerful. I think it's very important work that she does. And at the same time, she highlighted the tremendous ongoing struggle to really keep the effort going. So funding is always in short supply. The number of people who have the dedication that Vera has to go out and get out the word is limiting. In contrast, in the second panel, you know, Rafe and Phil were eloquent talking about the connection between what's happening in Greenland and Florida, the teleconnections and climate, sea level rise, these sort of global perspectives on what's happening in the Arctic and the consequences of it. Bob just did a really nice job in the same way of talking about sea ice, largely in terms of a global provider of services. I would submit that the interests that we all have in the global consequences of changing Arctic are somewhat endless in terms of the number of heroes, people like yourselves that can champion this, can talk about it, and the resources available to you, in stark contrast to what people who live in the Arctic have available to them. So I would just suggest to everybody in this room that we all need to really commit to being sure that the people of the Arctic stay connected in these conversations. It's almost like, you know, we need to figure out how to tithe or something, because let's face it, you know, they're not going to have the resources they need from the government to keep up this good work. They're going to keep trying. But somehow, those of us who are in the more global conversation, I think we have to take it on as a responsibility to make sure that we don't let the people of the Arctic get lost in this global and important conversation.
Thanks. I would take that as more of a comment than a question. So not necessarily need for any response unless somebody, okay, great.
I have actually a thought about it, which is to, if I look back at the Glacier Conference.
Closer to the microphone.
Closer?
Yes.
I'm thinking back to the Glacier Conference last September in Anchorage, when the president and his huge entourage went up there, and there was probably more interaction with Native Alaskans, with Alaskans, than there had ever been. And, but I mean, certainly by a president. And I think his commitment to this has continued because the indigenous people will be highly represented in this ministerial. So all I'm just saying is that paying attention to the global does not necessarily always divert from attention to the people of the Arctic, but sometimes it can bring greater attention and focus and resources, which I think came out of the Glacier meeting. I don't, it was a big part of it.
Peter.
So, we are getting into the discussion of different views of the Arctic and the future of the Arctic, and
I think it's on. I think you gotta just project.
it was actually okay. I can try to bite into it. So, is that better now?
Yeah.
So we are actually at the point where which I think is the critical point of this meeting, where the different views of what the Arctic should be as we move forward, and what the trajectory should be, and what can we do to reach that. Unfortunately, we have little to go by in terms of what you would call hard facts. I mean, one thing you can start with is that the if you say what is commonly defined as dangerous interference with the climate system, it's a 2-degree global. And so that has been revised downward because one group that felt that this doesn't serve their interest, the low-lying island nations, raised their voice in Paris and said it has to be 1.5 or lower. Now, if we will ever manage to do that, or the 2-degree, that's a different question. But at least there was a clear statement from that group as a unified voice that what is considered as acceptable globally does not work for us. So if you translate that now to the Arctic, one question that we have to ask is a global 2-degree, which translates into an Arctic 5-degree world, acceptable for those who are living in the Arctic and those who are sort of connecting to the Arctic by providing and using services. And maybe that is our way to tackle that a little bit, to say we accept for the moment the COP21 target and think a bit about what would that mean, and is that really acceptable, and if not, what kind of means do we have to at least voice that and suggest, possibly as the low-lying island nations did, what should the target be, and then of course one has to consider if there is any pathway towards that.
Rafe, you want to comment?
Sure. I'd offer a couple of starting points. In terms of, well, let me back up. In the design of the Framework Convention, the agreement was about avoiding dangerous interference, and that was quite a compromise. It has some more language, but it was non-specific. And in some ways, the climate system, dangerous interference has to relate to specific elements of the climate system. 1.5 or 2 degrees doesn't mean much until you translate it into impacts. Well, if the low-lying island states, if 2 degrees means the disintegration or partial disintegration of Greenland, it's not a sufficient standard to protect low-lying areas. I'm just offer so I offer in the Arctic the standard. You have to translate the impact you're trying to avoid into a temperature function if you're trying to relate it to Paris. So two elements of this might be can we allow permafrost to thaw? Can the world allow permafrost to thaw? And at what point do you have to stabilize the system, or can you, so it doesn't happen, because any target will be breached? Unlike forests are subject to human intervention, not the permafrost. Not on the ground, so to speak. Second is the ice sheet. I don't know if it's possible. We heard a lot of discussion about the Greenland ice sheet yesterday. And to what extent can the disintegration be stopped? That's another question. And if I'm sitting in a task force on the fate of the Arctic and the future of the Arctic, these are the questions I want to know. Well, okay, let's run the scenarios. What's required to avoid the thaw, and what's required to keep the ice sheet intact? Those are just 2 examples. Now, the question is, can it happen? What's required? I think that ultimately what Phil Rash had to say yesterday becomes part of the analysis, because time scale is really important here. When do you have to intervene, and how much to avoid these consequences? And that's what we haven't come to grips with as a society. You can go downtown in Washington and ask this question, and there's no answer at this point.
Just add a comment to that, and that is, well, just getting back to a few minutes ago, I was advocating for better modeling and better predictive capabilities particularly for the Arctic, and it's precisely for this reason that we don't know answers to basic questions like what is the right target? Is it 2? Is it 1.5? Is it 1.6? And in order to answer that question, we need better predictive capability. The other question that better predictive capability will answer for you is, okay, if we decide the correct target is 1.5 or 1.6 or 2, then what policies will get us there? And we don't know as much about that either as we should.
So I've got a few people waiting for
Right,
questions.
I just wanted
Okay.
just to go back before we go forward. There are on the order of 4 million people who live in the Arctic. The number has been going down, not up. There is, as it opens up and there's development, there's some thought that the number will go back up, but it's not at all clear whether those are jobs and growth opportunities that are going to be populated by indigenous peoples, or if these are going to be migrant workers coming up in the summer months and going back down. So, we have a planet where there are, I don't even know right now how many billions, but headed upwards towards 10. I don't think, everything we've heard about the science indicates that this is a single linked system, that the fate of the sea ice in the Arctic is linked to the fate of the temperature in the mid and lower latitudes of the planet. So I think these are decisions in the end that are going to be made by nations based on where the bulk of their populations live. I think that is the absolute stark reality of it. As with the island nations, I think we're successful in pushing to go to 1.5 from 2, largely because they were viewed as the canaries in the mine. They were viewed as the leading edge of climate change, and what they were seeing is exactly what was going to be seen not that far into the future in Florida and the Niger Delta and hundreds of other places. And I think that's probably an appropriate positioning or way to communicate between peoples of the Arctic and peoples at lower latitudes, is that the struggles that people in the Arctic are dealing with are the leading edge of climate change that is about to impact literally billions of people at lower latitudes.
So I've got a few questions lined up, but I just want to comment on what Rafe put out for the afternoon discussion. I think it is important, if we can, that we identify some of the critical functions that we can't lose, or that we believe collectively that we can't lose. For example, the function of carbon storage and methane storage that permafrost is providing, or the albedo function of sea ice, and then determine what questions we need to answer that were just raised here about whether there's anything we can even do about it, and what would be even marginally or remotely acceptable to think about, and get going on those with the ministerial. That you've got a bunch of nations who control a lot of science resources, and we have an opportunity to try and guide the science that they're going to do. And so we need to be as crystal clear as possible if we're going to communicate to them in a way that will have any impact. So I just would encourage us to really think about what are some of those things that just have to be maintained if we're going to have a viable planetary climate and civilization, and what are the questions that we need to look at about how they could be maintained. I have Brenda, Mojib, and Anders, and then Lou.
Thank you. I have a question for Phil. You showed some of those harsh environments on the far right of your slide, and I wanted to know whether you have had traction with policymakers regarding the budget that you showed, and in particular within the international space and the Arctic Council, in the context of what we have to do this afternoon. Because the budget you showed, there's the tension between, there are working groups for reducing tropical degradation and deforestation, REDD, and land use, and there's a lot of a lot of energy around that. And as we all know in this room, the budget numbers you showed, better Arctic monitoring and scientific collaboration on a scale that would be a grand challenge to be able to say what the permafrost thaw carbon flux would be annually, would be challenging. It involves sea ice, all the systems we know that affect that. But I think those budget numbers more directly tie into the policy process. So I'm wondering, have you had success? Are people hearing this? Is this the holy grail of understanding, or is it still people only think about the polar bear and sea ice?
I mean, look, well, I'll make a couple comments about that. You know, folks in the administration get it, you know, and I've briefed them on the Arctic, you know, high-level people on the Arctic, and they totally get it. There is not.
You got to speak up.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, speak up.
Oh, I said, you know, the folks at high levels in the administration totally get it about the Arctic. I mean, they, you know, I briefed them and I've showed them stuff similar to what I showed here and what others have shown here. And I will say there is zero skepticism about the science or the message. And what it comes down to is there's no political will to do anything in terms of addressing this problem beyond what I would call business as usual. You know, it's like, well, maybe we can find a scrap of money in such and such a budget, you know. And you know, to me, that's just completely the wrong paradigm. I mean, you know, when the Twin Towers in Lower Manhattan came down, nobody looked at, you know, can we find 5% in the budget? You know, it's like, we have to, the attitude is we have to do this, and we did it. And we didn't worry about where the money was going to come from or cost-benefit analyses. I mean, that's kind of where I am about this problem. In the Arctic in particular, we have to do this. We have to take the measures necessary to halt this unraveling. It's mandatory, and that's just why I was saying, you know, we should have massive deployment of truly clean energy technologies like wind and solar. And you know, I don't care if it costs 2 cents more per kilowatt hour. We have to do it. That's kind of where I'm at. Maybe I didn't answer your question, but it felt good.
All right, Mojib. Anders,
Yeah, I have a few comments. First comment about the 2-degree target. Okay, so I think we need to be precise here, because what it says in the Paris Agreement is well below 2 degrees. Okay, so the target is not 2 degrees, and so I think in the document we should spell this out very clearly, that it is whatever it means. I don't know what it means, but it is considerably less. This is how I understand well below, considerably less than 2 degrees, which is almost 1.5 degrees. Now, to get back to the climate convention, you know, avoiding a dangerous interference with the climate system. You know, we have already in the Arctic this dangerous interference with the climate system, with the Arctic climate system. It's obvious, okay? We have heard this today, you know, people are suffering. You know, it's happening already, okay? So I think what I want to say is that we should not fiddle around, you know, with scientific discussions. You know, when will the Greenland ice sheet disaggregate? You know, we will never find this out. You know, whether it will be 1.6, 2.8, you know, whatever number. I have no idea. So we should not be hung up with these discussions. You know, we should say we have reached already the limit, you know, and we should try everything, you know, to get not beyond this warming that we have already realized.
Anders.
Oh, that fits right in there. Very good. No, it's I'm actually with. My problem is the following: the Arctic will only be saved by the rest of the planet. No, we have to. There are a number of things that have to be done in the Arctic, but we already know that there is dangerous interference with the climate system. We most likely have passed the threshold of the Greenland ice sheet. But what we shouldn't do is, you know, it's now about, and we discussed this in Germany on the federal level and with the government and in Europe altogether. It's now about the right entrance strategy towards a transformation of the energy system. I know this is not enough, but it's something that's very important. Now, what doesn't help is just saying, making the problem worse and worse and worse, and just in order to increase the pressure. We've done this for a long time, and I think it was important, but I think we've now also reached a point where, as you said, the administration totally gets it in the US. The administration in the UK gets it. Well, I'm not sure about the new one, we'll see. But in Germany, a number of countries, they get it. We have a Paris Agreement. And now it's about how to get to the solution and how to get, and that is exciting and difficult. And I'm not, I don't know what the solution is. I know we have to get the transformation eventually. But if we give the impression that it's already too late, if we give the impression that we practice it's done, and then the step towards getting terrible fixes, like, again, solar radiation management or something like this, I don't know. Getting terrible fixes is the step is so close, and it's not up to us to actually decide what society, well, at least as a scientist, it's not up to me to decide what society should be doing. It's up to me to give the precise information. And for Greenland, it means we have passed the threshold most likely, but if we go back, we won't get the ice sheet back to its original state, but we'll stop the melting. If it gets colder in the Arctic again, the sea ice will return. We learned this today, and these are the kind of information that we have to bring out there. We are really on the edge, and we have to say we are on the edge, but we can go both ways. I'm just saying that we have to leave this in the window, of opportunity.
Yeah.
Anybody want to comment?
I do. I want to say something about solar radiation.
Closer to the mic.
Solar radiation management. I want to say something because it's a terribly controversial subject. Now, in the U.S. government, there is no research program on geoengineering. Our government doesn't know what it thinks because it's been unable to have a research program. There's no question that there are risks with its deployment, but the analysis is likely to show, or might show, that there are risks if we don't deploy it. That's the timescale issue, and that's what we face. Now, with a rapid deployment of decarbonization of the energy system, controlling methane, carbon removal, maybe we get there, maybe we don't. So that's what the analysis is required, is when do you have to intervene to protect these systems that we can't afford to lose? And that's where you have to have an analysis of as one potential tool of SRM. We also need to do the analysis to know if it's a terrible idea because others will bring it forward. So either way, we have to know. And I think the Academy's report said the major conclusion was we ought to do the research. So I wanted to point out, that's the way I think about it.
I just wanted to go back to this comment about, like many of you in the room, I'm in the nailing down the details business, and it is what I do for a living. I would like the funding to continue so that I can continue to do it because I love doing it. But I don't think that the inaction on climate change has anything to do with our inability to put a date on when the permafrost is going to, become a large positive source, or a date on when the West Antarctic ice sheet is going to really start to slide more quickly into the ocean. I just don't believe it for a second. I think it's great work, and we should continue to do it. We make policy. We make major, enormous investments in economic policy based on uncertain data about the future. We do it every day. It's accepted. That's how the government operates. It's not plausible that the small uncertainties in timing and exact temperature breakpoints are what's holding us back. I really believe that these are serious governance conflicts. They're differences in policy based on different economic and socio-economic social interests, and we need to be straight up about that and take those issues on directly. And if we have If we really believe that keeping the Arctic keeping the sea ice extensive in the summer Arctic is critical to global climate and to preserving a reasonable way of life in the Arctic, then we actually need to find those people who are allies in that and start to, coalesce and work together on bringing that message out as widely and immediately as possible. I think that's the issue at this point. I think the science is basically in.
Okay, just quickly, because we've got other people waiting to
Okay, sure. No, you're right. I mean, what's missing is the political will, but that is why I think the message that this affects us all. It is about the consequences of Arctic change are global and potentially catastrophic and potentially, essentially permanent. I think that is a key message that I would hope would have some chance of generating political will. The other thing I'll say is Anders' comment is exactly right, that it's really unhelpful to convey the impression that it's too late to take effective action. But I think it never is truly, right? I mean, even if one crosses thresholds or tipping points, more emissions, more warming is always going to be worse, and there's always going to be another threshold and another tipping point out there. And finally, on geoengineering, Rafe, you're just right, that there is no organized U.S. government research program, and I can tell you the reason for that is that, the individual federal agencies are scared of it. They're scared of the political ramifications of it, and it would help if there were some leadership from the White House on this, but it hasn't happened.
Lou, and then Doug.
Thank you. That one's being held together by duct tape.
1, 2.
Okay, I'm going to use them both.
Okay, thanks, Lou.
Okay, hold on a minute. I'm ready.
Great question.
So I was struck by the quote that Phil put up at the end of his presentation about the next few years being critical. And I thought in sort of this question of setting the context for our afternoon conversation, whether it might be useful to think about the political windows that are going to exist over the next couple of years and how the things that we, the messages that we want to get out, the work that needs to be done, how to fit our ideas and the discussions we've been having into those political windows, especially these global windows. I think, they have their limitations, but as Rafe said, they also have this forcing mechanism that I think we've seen. We saw most recently in 2015 with Paris and the run up to Paris. So I think we should keep our eye on those. So there's just a few that I'd flag. One, we've obviously been talking about the Arctic Council process. I think that's really important. I just don't think that's where we should limit our thinking in terms of where we can have an impact with the messages and the work that we're doing together. Another is the special report that the IPCC is going to do on 1.5 degrees. It is due to land in 2018, but the window is going to close this year in terms of inputs that we can make into the scope of what that report will look like and the information that will be considered in that assessment. And a few things that we've talked about the last 2 days are obviously relevant to this. What we know about the future of the Greenland ice sheet and how that relates to the space between 1.5 and 2, right? And there's a lot of other things. That IPCC special report in 2018 will be one of the key framing pieces for the 2018 global stocktake, which is the first window under the structure created in Paris for countries every 5 years to come back to the table together and talk about the collective challenge and to evaluate our progress against the goals. So the 2018 global stocktake moment is also a critical moment where I think our ideas and the information that we want to get out and the asks that we have need to come into that conversation. That global stocktake will inform a year in 2019 that is like the year we just had in 2015, where all governments are going to be back on the hook to put ideally put revised 2030 targets on the table. Those will be national targets, but there's also other things that we could bring into that conversation. That's going to be a really hard ask for governments, because we're basically asking them to revise what they already, a year ago developed politically within their own domestic systems, which means that moment is going to be a hard one to get what we need. But if that moment fails to create new ambition, then the whole experiment of Paris will be, I think, you could argue it has failed its first big test. So you've got that in 2019. In addition, over the next couple of years, and there's not a firm deadline, but the United States is going to do its one of these before the end of this calendar year, is all governments in Paris were told to develop mid-century low-carbon development strategies. So the U.S. is going to release its version of this probably in Marrakesh. So this is a planning document that looks at what trajectory we need to be on and what are the steps we need to take between now and the end of the century. Every country has to do one of these. What if the Arctic did one? What if the Arctic nations did one? So, so these are just a few spots on the calendar that we should be thinking about. The last sort of thing I would say is related to research agenda. One of the big things that came out of Paris, even though Paris was mostly about, formally it was about a document called the Paris Agreement, and then it also produced a set of national commitments. It did a whole bunch of other things because of this political conversation and the pressure that came into it. One of them was a global research agenda on renewable energy and clean energy technologies. What if we had something like that for the research that needs to be done on the Arctic? And what if we asked the world to do that as part of one of these big moments? I think how we think of this bigger context and to land our ideas in it, I think, is really important.
Thanks. I'll take that as a comment rather than a question. And I think one that gets taken up in part in Stephanie's session on communications, and then in the afternoon as we chart out a strategy. So I'm going to maybe take two more, and then we'll move to the communications session. So Doug and...
I was really struck by the discussion, and especially the discussion around how the small island states were able to influence the course of global energy policy, which is really what happened. And I think the canary in the coal mine analogy is pretty good, but I think we can take that canary analogy one more step. I mean, the fact is, the fairly brutal fact is that those small island states and their regions do not play, I think this is true, a critical role in the climate system or the Earth system for the rest of the global population. And that's a clear contrast with the small number of people, special lives in the Arctic. It's also a contrast with Antarctica. But we have a contrast in that our canary actually is standing, or maybe right now, according to Mujib, maybe it's just sort of kipped over and lying on the floor. Our canary is half lying on the floor, slightly conscious, slightly unconscious, next to an enormous lever, which in this cartoon lever has global climate system on or off, or good or bad or something. So I think we need to make that point, and the risk is, with the ministerial summit that I see, is that while the changes in the Arctic and the impact on economic development in the Arctic, obviously social development in the Arctic, are extremely, extremely important regionally and for the people that live there, and we need to work closely with the people that live there and are thinking of developing that region. We need to work with them. The real importance lies in the implications for the rest of the Earth system. So we need to emphasize at this ministerial summit the teleconnections, of which there are a large number. I think we're missing still a few. And we need to really emphasize that and show that this is a common issue. But for me, it's the canary sort of lying next to the lever, on life support maybe, but still could be rejuvenated in order to keep the lever in its right position.
That's a great point, Doug. I just want to make one comment, and I would really defer to Craig and to Vera if I'm off base on this. But it seems to me that, as different from the small island nations, which are literally disappearing in the Arctic, I think it's a not trivial process how you get to consensus within the Arctic about how people feel about these changes and what policies they would like to see I think it's a process, and it would hopefully linked in with these global debates, but it's not I would guess there's something happens in between here and having some kind of position that those communities would want to bring into the conversation.
Okay, yes.
Okay, sorry. Kathleen Kelly from the Center for American Progress. Great panel. Thanks so much for your presentations. And all of you, as you were speaking, were reminding me of the opportunity that we have right now with the science ministerial. And I've been the last couple of days trying to figure out kind of what would be the most useful product from this group. As someone who used to work at the White House and frequently writes policy memos to the White House and public papers to kind of put pressure on the White House or to give cover to the White House to take action, just a couple of ideas have come to mind about what this briefing paper or white paper from this group might do. And I feel like that this group has a moment or opportunity within the next couple of weeks to really share with the White House exactly what you want the joint statement from the science ministers to look like. They will issue a joint statement at the meeting, in addition to launching a whole series of collaborations on science. So ideally, in my view, the joint statement would reflect a lot of what we've talked about over the last 2 days. What we currently know about what is happening in the Arctic and the grave consequences in the region and globally, and really putting together just a nice, 1 or 2 paragraph, couple paragraph summary, concise, because these statements are concise, about the state of play on the science and what we know. And then I think there's, Phil, your slide on kind of what do we need to do, these recommendations for action. There's an opportunity here for the scientists, the science ministers, to really state clearly how urgently we need world leaders to act. And I think the science will speak for itself, but and also to give hope. I think, Phil, your point about the fact that we do have a small window of time to act. I think having the science ministers reflect that hope and then the urgency to act. And then lastly, I think this statement would offer, ideally, recommendations to world leaders on policy and science, with the policy being along the lines of what we've seen in the last several joint statements from President Obama and Trudeau, President Obama and the 5 Nordic leaders with China, and on the need to rapidly implement the Paris Agreement, to have countries come up with their long-term low greenhouse gas emissions development strategies, and to come forward every 5 years with increasingly more ambitious national goals. And I think that the science ministers, are in a good spot to communicate that urgent need, not the specifics of the policies, but just the urgent need to implement what we've already committed to and to get it done in an even more ambitious way going forward. And I just say all this because I think this paper, there's only just a few weeks here for this paper to be effective, and having, with the thought of what do you want that ministerial statement to look like, and having your paper really reflect that in a compelling and concise way, I think could be powerful.
Thank you. I think that's a really useful comment. Any last reaction to that, or any final closing comments before we turn to the communications part of this session?
I sort of think we're already in the communications part, so maybe we should move on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Okay, so our last presenter for the morning is Stephanie Furman, and we'll hear from her, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion and break for lunch after that, and then get into our working groups.
Yeah, thanks, Brad, and thanks very much for this input. This is exactly the direction we wanted to go. So, as we talked about it this morning, we said, a lot of the afternoon is going to be about what do we want to communicate, and so we thought just before lunch we could take a step back and kind of reflect about, how, and what are some of the issues in terms of communication. Everybody here, Mojib talked about, having to respond, to various phone calls and about changes, and kind of sometimes you don't feel equipped to do it, and sometimes over time, you learn how, and other people are more professionally trained. I just wanted to say that I'm the lead on this Polar Learning and Responding Climate Change Education Partnership. It's been funded by NSF for 6 years. We have one more year of funding. And what our goals are is to inform public understanding of and response to climate change using novel educational approaches. So we're not just preaching to the choir, that use the changing polar environments and are geared towards lifelong learners. A lot of people, when they think of education or communication, they're often thinking, when they first say education, they're often thinking of like K-12 or something like that. And but only 1 in 5 people are actually in a formal education environment. And the ones that we want to be influencing are the ones who are making decisions now, or who are voting, or something like that. And so we really need these approaches to reach the people through informal education means, because we're not going to get them through the classroom. Our partners on this, many are here. So Peter is one of the co-PIs. Mary Beth is involved with doing some really cool projects. Jessica Brunicini is our assistant director on the project, and Teresa, our wonderful Teresa, is running everything for us. We have a variety of people involved with this, from formal and informal science educators, climate specialists, learning and decision specialists. We're working with Future Ocean on a project, and we've got Hurtigruten Cruises in Norway who's working with us. So it's been a really fun collaboration. This just to set the background for the fact that you can do some novel things. We have the traditional white papers that people have been talking about, but think more broadly about ways that you've been influenced and things that you have found to be effective, and let's see if we can come up with some of those ideas here as well. Now, I want to raise some caveats. So first of all, yesterday we were going through, and actually today as well, a whole bunch of challenges that we're facing in terms of communicating about this topic. So first of all, Brenda brought up this issue of people saying as shorthand, ice-free. Whether it's largely ice-free or totally ice-free is a really big issue because it means a whole habitat shift. It means, that you're kind of transforming the environment. Can you reseed populations or not? So we should be kind of precise about our terminology. Another thing is that everyone still, that you meet in the general public, thinks that when you say ice-free or largely ice-free, they're thinking in winter as well. So they're thinking of, a balmy, warm Arctic Ocean throughout the year. And so that's something that, even when I was in DC, we had to just kind of drive that point home. And so a lot of the people who are, professionally involved do get it. But the people who are staffing or actually the staffers often know more than the others, but people who are kind of on the periphery but involved and they think they know something often don't know as much as you think. Another one is this idea of uncertainty and variability that came up as well versus the trends. And a lot of people are talking about how it's much more important to communicate about trends than to get into the weeds of uncertainty and variability. And yet that's what's happening in the Arctic. So we're going to be facing those issues as we talk about things this afternoon. I think a really critical issue that came out is that we're not one Arctic. One Arctic is the U.S. Arctic Council theme. And what they mean is that, we're kind of all in this together and we need to work together. But we heard yesterday on so many different levels, we're not one Arctic. And then today, we also heard it in terms of the diverging stakeholder interests. So, regionally, we're not one Arctic. In terms of impacts, we're not one Arctic. And so that's something else I think it's going to be hard for us to sort of generalize, but that's something that we're just going to have to face. Another one is the choice of emission scenarios, and I think that Anders raised this really neat point talking about our window of opportunity, and a lot of people get hung up on the choice of emission scenarios, and they keep going back to those, and I think as we're talking about how we want to frame things, I think making this distinction between, you know, when they're all basically going in the same direction and when they diverge and what the options are is, it's going to be I think it's going to be complex to try to communicate that, but I think that's something that's critical that we need to do. Another one that came up in a couple of different ways, I think first with Franz, which was really interesting, was that the rules are changing, you know. He talked about in terms of biology when we were talking about predictions, and he said, well, you can keep on doing more of what the models are set up to do, but what happens when things fundamentally change? And then Robin talked about this as well, where the biological responses, we don't have, you know, the rules are changing. When Robin talked about it with the relocation, we don't have the framework, we don't have the governance. Building codes we don't have, and then we talked about it with geoengineering as well. So we're into sort of totally new territory in many ways. And that's something that makes it, you know, really a challenge, because we're not exactly sure, you know, how things are going to play out, and we have to envision scenarios and storylines, I think, which is really interesting. It's just not as easy. Another thing is the solar radiation management tension. You know, that came up here today, and that's something that clearly is playing out across, you know, the agencies and different countries as well. So these are some issues that came up, and this is more on the communication on the professional level. What I wanted to, we asked Larry Hamill to come, and he wasn't able to attend, but I wanted to raise for you, with you, some of his research that he's been doing through polling, so you can get a sense of where the public is, because almost every speaker who's talked about communicating to decision makers or policy makers says, hey, but they're driven to urgency, you know, by the will of the people. So let's take a look at what people know and what they don't know. So first of all, many people don't know that the high Arctic is an ocean covered with thin ice. The numbers are, this says, which of these best describes the North Pole? Ice a few feet or yards thick floating over a deep ocean, or ice a mile thick floating over land, not floating over land, over land. It's 40% say thin ice, and 39% say thick ice over land. So they're thinking at the North Pole they have a mile thick ice. So this is like guessing, right? So most people don't know that it's an ocean. Okay, so this is really fundamental to a lot of what we're talking about. Another thing is there's some good news here. So many people know or guess that Arctic sea ice has declined. That's been in the news a lot. 60% of people think that if the Arctic warms, it will have a major effect on weather where they live. If you add in the people who think it will have a minor effect, that's 89% of people think that there's this connection with weather. They have this, they've been seeing the changes, and they're attributing them to the changes in the Arctic. This is actually, yeah, this is North America. So he in some cases, he's using New Hampshire because he's found it tracks very similarly to North America, to the US, not North America, sorry. But this is the one that gets to the issue we're just talking about. Only 30% know that Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets would most affect sea level. When they were asked what would most affect sea level if melted, 32% said sea ice, 30% said Greenland, Antarctic land ice, and 11% said Himalayan glaciers. 28% said they didn't know. So this is a lot of people who don't know fundamentally what's causing sea level, and they're attributing it incorrectly. And then this is really interesting. So he's done work on the party affiliation or party association of the people who are answering these polls. And if we go all the way to the right on that last question, so Greenland and Antarctic sea level, there's no party difference. So he's looked at Democrats, Independents, Republicans, and Tea Party in that order. You'll see it spread out there. So on that purely factual question about, you know, the sea level rise, people just don't know, and they answer. It's like, you know, there's no difference between the parties. When you start to get questions that have to do with something vaguely political, like, you know, melting ice is going to, or changes in the Arctic are going to affect my weather, which you can start thinking is like global warming even if you don't know the details. You see this huge spread between the different party affiliations. So the Tea Party, not surprisingly, is down on the bottom, you know, and then it's the Republicans, the Independents, and the Democrats. And so these are things that where people change their perception of kind of facts based on their party, which is called biased assimilation, where they're accumulating evidence that fits into their mental model. Whereas in the Greenland model, it's basically an information deficit. Now this is interesting too, because if you take a look at this next plot, what you see here is he also asked people, how much do you know about climate change? So this is self-assessed knowledge. And you can see a really interesting thing where the Democrats, Independents, and Republicans all, if they think they know more about climate change, then they do better on the questions. About this, about ice area loss and major effects on weather, or they tend to attribute it more. But the Tea Party, it actually goes the other way. And so this very extreme, political association where they're the ones who are causing these differences in the biased accumulation, even more so than the others. So this is the landscape that we're functioning in within the US. And this is part of, I think, driving part of the lack of urgency. And so it's something just to keep in mind. I'm not quite sure how it's going to play into how we communicate this, but if we can be aware that the communication tools that we're tailoring, for the professionals will be different than the way potentially that we reach out to the general public, and we need to be thinking about, multiple strategies and kind of a portfolio that will reach different people in different ways. So with that, I just wanted to ask Brendan to make a couple comments because he was very recently at OSTP, and he will also be able to give us some ideas about potential, as we just heard about some, feeding into the joint statement is one option, but I'm sure you have some other perspectives on how we can be most effective. And then what I'd like to do is start thinking yourself about things that you maybe have experienced that you found to be effective, and we can have a discussion about that. So Brendan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Stephanie. I guess I would just say it might be useful to recognize that you could think of this Arctic Science Ministerial as really having two aspects to it. There is going to be a closed session of the science advisors for the nations involved, and that's a place where there may, in fact, I think there's a real opportunity to have some agreements made that could substantially affect the way we observe and understand the Arctic. So just really moving some of the places where we're scientifically stuck, I would argue. The other element will be peripheral events that are a great opportunity to sort of leverage the kinds of communications we've been talking about. I don't know how else to say this other than just to say it, that the teams working on those two elements within the White House are far from concordant. So they're quite capable and to some extent are pulling in quite different directions. That's just a reality. It's not unique to this ministerial, I don't think. But I do think it suggests to us that we should be very thoughtful about where we want to put our effort. What are we trying to do? Are we really trying to influence that closed conversation, or we really want to focus on the communications that happen around the event and that try to use it as an opportunity to amplify messages? I think that's going to be really important to sort of sort out in where we would have the biggest impact.
So what would be the different ways that we would have impact with the two?
Well, I think there's a lot of things about, for example, where we are tripped up in terms of collaborating internationally in Arctic science that are pretty unsexy, really. But it's not something that's going to make a really flashy, statement out of the ministerial, but could make a real long-term difference in the conduct of science. So, from my perspective, we need some kind of nuts and bolts fixes to problems on setting up observing systems for the long term that have to do with prioritization, have to do with aligning, funding timelines. We need help from the top to push within each of these nations. So the ministers are in position to really move within their countries, make structural changes that have to happen so that we could do a better job of having collaboration in observing in a sustainable way. It's just not very exciting and sexy to talk about, but it will have a long-lasting impact. So to me, that talks to what kinds of concrete suggestions we can give them that, look, this will really make a difference. At the same time, there are all these things we've been talking about here that, yes, we want to keep amplifying these messages. We can talk about canaries in the coal mine and how people in the Arctic fit in that and don't, et cetera. But those are important, but I see it as a distinct opportunity.
So we've got Hayo, Anders, Scott, and Kathleen, and Brenda.
To add to that, though, I think one unique aspect of the meeting is that it involves non-Arctic nations in a forum that is about the Arctic itself. And so I see a great potential there to provide some guidance or some direction to countries who have an interest in the Arctic but may actually be struggling with how they can, what their role is, and the role of some of these countries within an Arctic context is evolving, whether it's the EU or individual EU member nations, whether it's Asian countries. And so I think it would be very important for this group to have some very specific and concrete suggestions on how these countries can engage. Two areas where I think, sort of following on Brendan's comments, where that would be the case is, one, getting back to some of the things we heard earlier today from Vera and others, I would argue that it makes a lot of sense to say, look, I mean, if co-management of resources works in Alaska and other countries, but these efforts are resource-strapped, but at the same time countries that have vessels coming into the areas where walrus or polar bear or other species are co-managed, then thinking about a co-funding effort that actually supports this and has an exchange that also involves guidance from the people in these regions on what type of observations or data are useful would be one thing to consider. The other piece relates more to the high Arctic, you know, where you have these requests for extended continental shelf discussions out there, where the marine scientific research regime isn't at all clear about, you know, what does this actually mean? And if you look at the sort of gets back to some of the points that were made earlier as well. If you look at the way we're doing scientific research, the way we're addressing some of these problems of rapid change, that has to be done in a way that isn't reflected in the classic language in, say, Convention of the Law of the Sea or some of these other bodies, or even in national laws. And so finding ways to explore more effective, more rapid, and more collaborative approaches to some of these questions would be important. And you could argue that the high Arctic is a good area to do that because there's the least impact on the coastal states. It's an area that's undersampled, very difficult to access, and an area where a lot of these other countries, whether it's Asian nations or European countries outside of the Arctic, can make a big difference because they actually have more assets to get up there than we do.
I've got Anders, Scott, Kathleen, Brenda, and then Dave. And I don't want to, and Mary Beth, we do have lunch ahead of us, and I don't want to get into the substance of the ideas because that's what we're going to take up after lunch. Okay, so just if you have ideas about communication options and venues and, you know, some caveats, so more thinking of it from the process perspective than the actual content perspective. So Anders.
Okay. I should be much more relaxed. I'm sorry. I'm not really. I should be, but I'm always too engaged on this. I have 3 points, very very simple. But I'm not sure this is the right moment now. The 3 points that we might want to add to the paper, and one is we heard this from Jennifer yesterday. I think the Arctic has a really important role for the rich countries south of them. With the polar vortex and the meandering of the jet stream. And it also has a very important role for the rest of the world because of the Greenland melting. I think these are two things. One is the long-term perspective. The other one is really short-term and has economic effects. And that is special in the Arctic. So we have to care. And also, I think something that we need to, or we might want to highlight is that it's not just the impacts that we are seeing now, but we are already locked in for the next 25 years, right? So whatever impacts we are expecting in the next 25 years is already kind of happening now.
Scott?
Thanks. I did want to share an experience I had fairly recently about communication issues. Last summer I attended a week-long kind of boot camp for early career polar scientists. And one of the more eye-opening experiences I had there was when we had to take a personality test, sort of an abbreviated version of the Myers-Briggs test, for anyone who's familiar with that, before attending. And so at first I was a little bit puzzled. I was like, why are we taking this personality test before talking about polar science? And we ended up devoting an entire afternoon to discussing the different dimensions of the personality test and talking about where we fell, the participants in this workshop, fell on the various spectra of the test, and then comparing that to the results from the public at large. And one of the key dimensions is basically what sort of things do you pay attention to? What kind of catches your eye? And on one end of the spectrum, you've got people who kind of pay attention to things that they see in their daily life, sort of concrete things that they encounter very regularly. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who pay attention to patterns and possibilities. And if you see where I'm going with this, the group of scientists, early career polar scientists, fell overwhelmingly on the patterns and possibilities end of the spectrum, and when compared with the population at large, it was overwhelmingly on this other end. So I think that's something really important to keep in mind in terms of how we think about information and how we present that is very different from the way that the public often apprehends that information. So being sensitive to that, I think, is going to be really important. Thanks.
Kathleen?
Just to my brother Brendan's point about the fact that there's these two bodies of things that need to be communicated, the kind of more sexy, high-level, urgent need to act by articulating what we know about what's happening in the Arctic and the global consequences, and then this whole body of collaboration on observations and research and data sharing to advance our knowledge in the Arctic. And I think what I heard from Mark Brzezinski at the White House is that this meeting actually presents both of those opportunities, or a chance for this group to influence both of those. The joint statement from the ministers will be this high-level, what's happening in the Arctic, why we need urgent action, and perhaps what world leaders need to do about that. And then, in addition, there will be a fact sheet that will describe the bilateral and multilateral collaborations that the science ministers will announce on data sharing, observations, and so I think that the group should have both of those in mind in terms of what should be communicated in the next couple weeks to the White House.
Thanks. Brenda? Okay. So we have Dave and Mary Beth.
Yeah, thanks. I'll make this very quick. On the ice-free, what at least I've found has been kind of helpful is when I tell people it's ice-free, it's like saying that Boston is snow-free in the summer, but nobody would ever think of getting rid of all the Boston snowplows because it comes back. So like when you're arguing for icebreakers, it's like, you don't use the snowplows 12 months out of the year, but you sure need them when you need them. And people, it's like, oh, okay, it's that kind of ice-free, like it doesn't snow in Boston in July, and they get that. As opposed to Miami, where you don't buy snowplows, you buy pumps to get rid of the sea level, but that's a different issue. The other part, on the comment earlier on sort of how do you almost crowdsource, think of Argo for the Arctic. Not literally Argo for the Arctic, but the model. I mean, one of the successes of Argo, I don't know if everybody knows that here, but it's kind of this ocean observing system that grew from the ground up. It was not some massive multi-billion government-directed project. It kind of grew from the observers, or from the principal investigators up, and it's really been tremendously successful. but every country who wants to can afford it. It's literally a few, tens of thousands of dollars, and you're in the club. You don't have to have huge commitments. Everybody shares the data, So, is there some sort of tagline at a ministerial of Argo for the Arctic, and conceptually to use this idea that everybody can play, everybody's data is helpful, and we want everybody to play?
Thanks. Mary Beth?
Is it on? Okay, so recognizing that this is largely directed towards the U.S. A senior Arctic official and science minister, but also acknowledging there's at least one other Arctic nation here besides Canada. I want to maybe at some point have some discussion about how the material that comes out of this, and this is something that Doug Wallace and I were talking about at the coffee break, can be used by the other Arctic nations. In Canada, as the representative to Arctic Council for the Arctic Institute under our permanent observer status, I wrote to the minister, the ADM, who's responsible for pulling together the Canadian position for the Science Ministerial, specifically asking how the Canadian scientific community and Indigenous organizations could contribute input to Canada's position for the ministerial. And the short version of the response I received is sort of like, well, the US has opened this up in a way that we did not anticipate, and then sort of we should have a discussion about it, to which there's been zero discussion. So I think that there are a couple of things that we could think about. One is that this represents a largely US group, but there is international input. How do we convey that there was international input into this position, including from all 5 scientists from other Arctic nations, as well as the EU? And then the other is, how might we in other countries that will participate in the ministerial take what comes out of here back home? To what extent can we or should we feel free to use this in our home countries? Because I do not feel comfortable sending a Canadian contingent off to the science ministerial with zero science input. That's my political comment for the day.
Yeah, so thanks to everybody. I mean, we all have a lot of collective experience in handling things along these lines, and it's great to see it coming together here. So I'll just turn it back over to Brad. In addition to closing out this morning's session, he's also going to have to take off, and so we can get some parting comments from him.
Right, well,
guidance for this afternoon.
I just want to try and summarize everything that was said this morning. I'm not going to do that. All I'm going to say is that was a really a robust discussion, and I think there was a lot of really good points that I hope we can draw out and take into the ministerial and well beyond the ministerial. I think Lou laid out a whole series of stops along the way here. This is a long journey. The ministerial is just the first point on the map, the most proximate point at the moment, but there's a collective energy of this group, I think, and a collective a really strong collective body of knowledge and expertise and skill, and I think we can be really influential here. And so I want to encourage us to go for that as much as possible, and to keep that together. And we'll do from our side everything we can to continue to support and strengthen and amplify the messages coming out of this group. So I'm sorry I have to leave this afternoon, but I'll be looking closely forward to what you produce and to continuing on with you. So with that, we can invite everybody to lunch. Thanks.